Hi everyone, it's Gigabeef here, and today we're going to start off with a question. If you had a weapon with two hypothetical attachments, both with minus 50% recoil, what would the final recoil of your gun look like when you applied them? If you're not sure, or you just want a refresher, then this video is for you. Alright, so the recoil system is another area of misconception in Tarkov when it comes to attachments, and more precisely what the effect is that they have on the weapon when applied. This is why the question that I asked in the opening is important, as even though it is not practical and doesn't actually exist in Tarkov, well, kind of, it will prove useful to show that the approach to recoil that Battlestate have taken so far with respect to modding and what the implications are for our builds. Jumping right into it, there are two broad ways that you could easily implement the recoil reduction calculation from attachments when modding weapons, which is either with an additive approach or a multiplicative one. If maths is not really your thing, don't worry, as these are fancy words for simple concepts, as these things usually are in my experience, and really all it boils down to is whether you have the concept of diminishing returns or not within the system. With the multiplicative approach, the more recoil reducing parts you add, the less effect they start to have on the overall build. This system is similar to having to distribute stat points in an RPG, where it gets progressively more expensive as you go higher in a specific stat, or something that we do particularly in Tarkov, which is deciding on recoil versus ergonomics. Some of the meta builds don't slavishly follow minimum recoil only, because if you have to pay for that extra 1% of recoil with 10 ergonomics, most players will choose to sacrifice this on the basis of gaining a lot of ergo instead. These are just two examples of how a stat gets progressively more expensive, so to speak, relative to something else as you add points to it. Now, you might assume that this is how the recoil system works in EFT, and I've spoken to so many players that just believe that this is the case. It is so common in games to have it work this way that people assume sometimes that this is exactly how it does work. What this means is that if you had a weapon with 100 recoil and two 5% recoil reduction attachments, each would reduce the overall recoil by 95%. So you get 95 and then 95% of 95, which is 90.25. As you can see, the recoil reduction of the second is less than the first, and if we kept on adding attachments, we'd find that the last few reduced the actual recoil number by the least amount. Obvious but important to point out here is that the percentage change in recoil for each step matches what the number of the attachment says, i.e. 90.25 is 5% less than 95. That is all well and good and describes a multiplicative approach, i.e. the recoil benefits are multiplied together before being applied to the weapon's recoil to get to our end result. However, Tarkov does not use a multiplicative approach, instead favouring an additive one. In this scheme, all of the recoil increases and decreases from all the attachments are added together and applied to the base recoil in one go. In our example above, this would give you 5% plus 5% for a 10% reduction and result with a weapon that has 90 recoil from a base of 100. This is very close to our other example, but this is because the numbers that we're talking about are quite small. As the numbers get larger, the additive approach deviates from the multiplicative one and gives greater recoil benefits as the overall recoil reduction applied to the weapon increases. In contrast to the previous method, adding a new attachment gives a greater percentage decrease in recoil than you would expect just from looking at the stat in isolation. For example, if we're at 50 with 100 base recoil already and we add another 5% attachment, this will take our weapon to 45, which is actually a 10% improvement for the 50 that we were at before, as it's a 5% improvement versus the base recoil. Now that we know how the attachments actually work and how to apply their benefits, what do they apply to? With the additive approach, you need a base weapon recoil in order to apply all of these recoil reductions. This can be seen easily by going into the preset window for any weapon and pressing New. This gets you to the base weapon as far as Tarkov is concerned, and this is the number that is used when making the calculations. This is important for a number of reasons. I'm sure most of you have noticed that stocks on various weapons give most of the recoil reduction for a particular gun. These usually start at about 30%, which makes sense clearly as using the weapon with no stock or it folded down is pretty difficult for most weapons chambered in a decent caliber. However, the flip side of this means that weapons that have fixed unchangeable stocks like the MDR don't benefit from mods as much as those with replaceable stocks like the M4 because their base recoil that Tarkov looks at is so much lower. This is compensated for somewhat by making the starting recoil fairly low, but because it's that anchor that all the recoil calculations are made from, you can never get down to the super low recoil that the meta guns have. We can see how this works in the presets, so if we just bring up the MDR first, the 556 version, we can see that it has a stock recoil of 71. Now if we press New on the preset, we can see that it's got a base recoil of 87. We get down to 71 from 87 by 9% on the barrel, 8% on the default compensator, and minus 1% on the handguard. This gets us to minus 18% recoil overall, which is 71.34, which is exactly what it says on the preset system here. Now if we go and open the M4 instead, M4A1 in the preset system, we will see something quite different. So here, you've got a vertical recoil of 88. Now if we press New, the recoil of the M4 is actually 147 as base. So if we just bring up our actual preset again, we can see exactly how this is made up. So let's bring this back up. So here we have the stock with minus 27% on it, the 7% from the default compensator here, we get minus 4% actually from the barrel itself, minus 1% on the Colt buffer tube, and another minus 1% on the M4 upper. This gets us to 40% recoil reduction overall, which takes our 147 down to 88.2. It's now clear to see that if we think about a mod like the Daniel's Defense Wave Suppressor combo for a second, which is now 17% reduction, this will reduce the MDR recoil by a flat 15, whereas the M4 is more like 25, so you get around 1.7 times the effect from the suppressor combo on the M4. This is clearly a bit strange, but given it's a system that we have to work with, what's important is the implications of this reality and what it means for us, practically speaking, for our builds. As we saw before, the more mods we add, the better the recoil becomes, as the game applies the bonuses without any diminishing returns. Coming back to our hypothetical question from the start, if we had two attachments for a weapon with minus 50% recoil reduction each, this would actually enable us to get recoil to 0 on any gun. The attachments in the game have been created in such a way that this is not really possible, but interestingly, using the other approach, this would reduce the recoil by 75% instead, i.e. you'd start with 100, reduce it by 50% to get to 50, and then from that 50, you'd reduce it by another 50% to get to 25 under a multiplicative approach. Interestingly, there was a fun Reddit thread recently showing that it was technically possible to get to negative recoil for a very short amount of time in the new wipe, which was as a result of being able to incorrectly apply a second stock over the top of the base ADAR stock at the same time. This was patched almost instantly, but shows that this is indeed how the recoil system functions in Tarkov, and a negative recoil is actually possible if you can stack enough mods. This is the reason that stacking recoil reducing attachments is so meta in EFT, as the final mod that you add has the greatest percentage increase in effectiveness with respect to the recoil you had just before you put it on. The unfortunate flip side of this is that when first starting out, you really don't want to be adding any mods at all outside of possibly some ergonomics, and those that are incredible value, such as the rubber butt pad for stock AKs once you have Prap or 2 for minus 5% at 3.5k, or the spiked tactical compensator at minus 10% for 4k. Paying under 1,000 rubles per 1% reduction is a pretty sure deal to me, but almost none of the foregrips for recoil are worthwhile at an early stage. If you take the AKMS for example with its stock recoil at 131 and a base of 195, the butt pad takes us to 121 and the spike comp to 107, whereas adding budget foregrips is in the range of a few percent for more than this. At 2% recoil reduction, we only move 4 recoil from the weapon overall. Now, this is mostly regarding full auto weapons, as in semi, various guns are fairly usable even with high recoil numbers, but I noticed this when making my flea market and tier 3 trader guide for the M4 last wipe. Kind of no matter what you do, you end up in the 55 to 60 recoil territory, and that is simply because you're losing a few points of recoil on each attachment, which all add up to making most builds quite average. As an alternative, potentially you might want to look at the guns that have base low recoil like the SMGs, as these weapons handle well without an additional ton of mods. My favourite is the MP5 SD, which I've spoken about before and is buildable at Peacekeeper 2 and has crazy low recoil. The Vector also looks like it falls in this category, although I haven't actually been able to test it enough yet to verify. So hopefully you learnt something today. Please do consider dropping a like and a sub if you found the content useful. It really does help out the channel. You can also follow me on Twitter and Twitch to catch me when I'm live. Well, until then, I'll see you next time, and as always, have fun in your raids.